Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Rockhold, and I am the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on our fifth and final Bringing Europe Home installment. If you've been with us for the whole series, you know that it's been our goal to share with you not only what we experienced on the ground in Europe in 2023 with our participants, but also to share with you some of the pre-trip learning we did with those travelers and to bring their voices into the conversation as well. Today's a little bit different than our previous sessions. Today, instead of looking at kind of distinct individual locations that we stopped, we're looking at a little more holistically and thematically. So today's topic is memorialization. There's nothing that Dr. Klein really, very few things that Dr. Klein enjoys teaching quite as much as memorialization. And she's going to touch on many of the countries and many of the very specific locations that we went to on this trip, including a few hidden gems that even we didn't fully anticipate. At the end, we're going to be joined by two of our travelers, Jerry Rinaldi and Joyce Hess, to share some of their perspectives on the entire experience. And if you have any questions along the way, please drop those in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we'll come back at the end and kind of moderate those to Dr. Klein and our guests. So Shelley, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jessica. Let's get started. All right, as Jessica mentioned, we are going to touch on if you've been watching this series from the beginning, you'll maybe note that at various points we said, oh, we'll do this during our memorialization session, because certainly we can't talk about being in this place without talking about some of the memorials that went up and this process of memorialization throughout Europe. And as we'll see, a lot of the memorials that we're looking at, some of them are relatively recent. By that, I mean within the last 20 years. And a lot of that has to do with this sort of, as time goes by, various European countries are better able to face to take a different look at their wartime history. And of course, that very much depends on the location. So just to sort of give a contrast of dealing with the Nazi past, we'll have a look at Munich and Budapest. So this is one of the things, if you joined us for our Munich session, you'll note that I briefly mentioned some of the remaining landscape of the Nazi time period. And so what you see on one side in the black and white photo, this is one of the temples of honor that Hitler established to those who were killed during the failed Beer Hall Putsch of 1923. And so he had the people who were killed during that fight buried here in these temples of honor. And then you can see today, in the picture directly above it, those are the ruins of that space. And so what the city of Munich has done relatively recently is construct this Nazi documentation center, which is directly beside the former site of the Temples of Honor, on the site of the Brown House, which was the Nazi headquarters. You might remember that I mentioned that Munich was designated by Hitler as the capital of the movement. So this really did have an impact on how Munich was able to come to terms with its Nazi past, right? There isn't a lot of distancing that can happen when you are where the Nazi Party literally started. So it took a really long time. I'd say other parts of Germany were a little bit faster in terms of their memorialization process, in terms of understanding how to fit it in with their current identity. But the fact that now the site of what was the Nazi headquarters is now this documentation center that really takes the visitor through the history of the Nazi Party in Munich, and kind of, I don't know, owns up is the right word, but it really shows how the party's place in city history and the difficulty of getting this center established. It is a documentation center. It isn't a museum, and it doesn't have Nazi artifacts. They were very adamant that this not be a place that displayed Nazi artifacts, given that it was on the site of the former Brown House. It didn't want to in any way serve as a destination for neo-Nazis. This is, of course, what the Brown House looked like during the Nazi period. And then after the war, well, during the war in January, it was heavily bombed by the Allies, and then is eventually torn down following the war. When you're inside this documentation center, there's a really interesting view. So if you're looking through the window, you can see one of the ruins of that Temple of Honor. And beyond that, you can see the Königsplatz area where they would have all those rallies. But when you stand in this location, you can see those two photos that are kind of in the windows. Those are actually video. Well, those are videos, but they're videos. And so you can see several views of history all at once. There's a video that plays showing of Nazi times. Then there's a video that plays showing the Americans blowing up the temples of honor. And then, of course, when you are looking out in the present, you can see the ruins today. So it's a really interesting layering of history that they have constructed there. And I should also note that entrance to this center is, of course, completely free because they want to make it accessible to as many people, and they have a traveling exhibit area in the bottom as well. So we looked at some of these when we talked about the Munich session, some memorials to resistance. And what I wanted to just point out in this moment is that these are all happening, these installations to honor resistance happen in the 90s. So they are later to the Memorialization game. At the same time, they're well ahead of the Nazi Documentation Center, because it's in many ways a lot easier to memorialize acts of heroism and resistance than it is to put up a building admitting that the city was integral to the rise of the Nazi Party and its position in the country. If you weren't here for earlier sessions, I'll just say we have, these are to the White Rose Memorial. Those are to symbolize the leaflets that resistance group put out and spread throughout Germany, so that they were hoping to spread resistance and call other college students to act. A bust of Sophie Scholl inside the university where she attended classes, and also in the atrium where a janitor actually saw her distributing these leaflets, which got them eventually arrested and caught. And then the far picture is a memorial in Schurker's Alley. This is right outside of the Ferntellerhalle, where there was a memorial put those killed in the Bierhallputsch. And once the Nazis were in power, they had a memorial built. They had guards stationed at that memorial, and passed by were required to give the Nazi salute. And so people who did not want to do that, their act of protest was to take a different path. So if all that they could do is not give the Nazi salute by taking a different route, that's what they did. Eventually, they started posting guards in this alley as well, and people could be arrested for that action. But you can see those are sort of bronze stones that have been laid in the cobblestones to symbolize that path. Also in Munich, this is a memorial to the Great Synagogue, which was built in the late 19th century. It was the third largest synagogue in the country, and it was destroyed. You can see photos of it, the interior and the exterior there. It was destroyed in June of 1938, so ahead of Kristallnacht, which happened in November of 1938. And in some ways, they use this destruction to sort of like gauge the public's reaction to a major synagogue being destroyed. If you look at that top picture, that sketch, it's a sketch from like 1925. It's kind of in the middle of the drawing, and then on the left is the cathedral of the city. And so if you look at this view, this tells you a reality that was true in many German cities at the time, and that was these synagogues were very much a part of the German landscape of these cities. This was built in Old Town, even though it was built in the late 19th century. It was very much a part of German society, of this architectural landscape. And so that was something that the Nazis wanted to remove. And so they do this in June here in Munich. And of course, that's something that is repeated throughout the country on the night of November 9th, 1938, as a warning to, at this point, they're trying to get to scare the Jewish population, to make a big statement a violent public spectacle, and at the same time, they're making a broad argument about like Jewish landscape being removed as well. This memorial that you see was put up in 1969. And in July of 2023, they found the ruins of the synagogue in the river. So they were doing another construction project, and they found essentially several tons of stone that had come from this synagogue. Interestingly, the Nazis are not the ones who dumped it in the river. The destruction took place. A company who specialized in deconstruction took the ruins, and they were in the ruins were in their possession until the 50s. And then I believe in the mid-50s, that company dumped the remains in the river. So now they've been pulled out, and they will be probably put in the Jewish Museum of Munich at some point. Right beside that memorial you can see the bottom photo. This is Munich's version of the Stolperstein. So some of you may be very familiar with this. It's a Europe-wide project. At this point, there's over 60,000 of these little bronze plaques installed in the cobblestones throughout European cities. This was started by a German artist named Gunter Demig. He had the idea in 1993, and then the first installations began in 2003. And they are placed outside the last usually the last place of residence that a person had. And then it will say on that stone, on that plaque, it'll say what happened to them. So it'll have a birth date, the death date is known, it'll say that. It'll say if they were, this one, the top one here is actually from a member of a non-Jewish person who was a part of the resistance movement. And this was actually outside one of the churches that we saw there. But this says he was arrested and then eventually executed in Munich for being a part of the resistance. What's interesting too is they will note different categories. Like sometimes they use the word murdered, like so-and-so was deported and murdered. If someone killed themselves before they could be deported, that's noted on them as well. But what's interesting is, so this project really kind of took off, and if you are interested in getting Stolperstein placed, if you have family members, either who did not survive or did survive, you can contact this artist and get an installation put in if you know the address. But the Jewish community in Munich objected to the fact that the stones were placed on the ground. They thought there was sort of something disrespectful about it being on the ground. And so they, a number of Munich City Council to vote down the ability for these Stolperstein to be installed. And so kind of the compromise they eventually came to were putting them on the sides of the buildings instead. So that's what you see in the lower photo there. Stolperstein roughly translates to stumbling stone, stumbling block. And the artist's idea had the idea in relation to the Roma population that were deported, because he wanted to note people's last, like their residence, right? Instead of just putting a memorial in the center of town to say, there were once Roma people here, there were once Jewish people here, and now they're gone. He wanted to put them back in the spaces in which those people lived. And if you've been to Europe, if you've seen these, it actually is a very effective way. You're walking along and, just having a normal walk, and then suddenly you'll notice one and maybe more. And then you automatically know, like, well, this was once a Jewish neighborhood, right? Because there's just several of them there, but it makes you think about them, these people as individuals. I mean, you can see a name, you can see a birthday, a death date if it's known, right? So there's, it becomes very personal. And I think there's something that's really powerful about that personalization, rather than having it be, a single stone in a central location. And even though they are around, to have that sort of like moment of reflection in all these individual spaces. So it's a really interesting Europe-wide project. So if we contrast what Munich is doing to what's happening, say, in a place like Budapest, that was the final city that we visited on our tour, and we haven't spoken about it much in this series yet. This is a memorial that was installed in 2013 under Viktor Orban's government, and it received a lot of criticism almost immediately. And so what it shows you is this eagle attacking this angel, which the eagle symbolizes Germany. The angel, of course, is symbolizing Hungary. And it received a lot of criticism because, well, it is the occupation, the memorial to German occupation. Hungary wasn't occupied until very, very late in the war because they spent the majority of the time as an ally of Germany. And so in that allied status, they weren't occupied, and they did pass their own version of the Nuremberg laws. They did participate in, the deportation of their citizens. So it was heavily criticized as being a kind of a whitewashing of history. And so if you notice, you can see there's sort of papers and things in front of it. So let's have a little closer look at this. So to protest this kind of whitewashing of Hungarian history and the fact that this memorial in no way makes clear that the majority of the people killed under occupation were, of course, Jews. They were deported. And so the people started to correct this. And so they started leaving notes and pictures or a suitcase. And so it became this kind of like public response. And there was one particular group that started setting up chairs like every night at 7 p.m. and saying they were going to have a conversation Hungary's role in the war. And so in this photo, you can see someone has taken a picture of that initial police response in which the Hungarian police kind of stopped people from meeting for a time. And now that photo has become part of the installation. But it's really interesting because it's an ever-evolving, ever-changing aspect. Initially, the police did keep people from meeting, and they started removing the artifacts that people left there, the notes and whatnot that people left. And certainly after a time, they stopped doing the removal because people just kept putting them there. So it's a really interesting response to see both people within the country and then, of course, travelers from outside of Hungary as well, many of them wanting to commemorate their relatives that were lost there. Also in Budapest, but not open, is a museum called the House of Fates. And this was started in 2012, but it is still not yet open. And so this was, you can see it's huge, 600,000 square feet. It is meant to tell the story of the Holocaust in Hungary, and yet it is still not open. You can see it's empty. It's ready for guests, but there aren't any artifacts. It was originally kind of headed by Maria Schmidt, who is a right-wing historian, who's, we'll talk about her more here in a second, but has made these inappropriate parallels between communism and Nazism, who's done some Holocaust distortion, and certainly is not the person that you would want running a Holocaust museum. In 2018, it was turned over to a Hungarian Jewish group, and yet still that opening has been delayed. So that was not a place that we could visit because it still isn't open. And I think that says a lot about sort of the state of where the country is still grappling with, or not, with its Holocaust history. What they do have is the House of Terror, and this opened in 2002. And when it did open back then, it was it got a lot of attention, and it is in the building that was the former headquarters of the Gestapo. And then later, when the communists came to Budapest, they also used it to target enemies of the communists. So this is a building within the city that was used to terrorize its citizens under both regimes. And so you can see what they've, kind of the large scale that they've done there. And inside, of course, is a tank symbolizing the Soviet invasion. This museum is headed by Maria Schmidt. So again, that's kind of an interesting thing to note. There are 20 rooms within this museum. One of them touches on the Holocaust. The rest is about drawing parallels between communist rule and the Nazi rule as well, and even landing on the side that the communist rule was much worse. In the basement, they have the reconstructed prison cells. So it's kind of interesting to see in the immediate post-war, well, at a certain point in the Cold War, they stop using this for interrogation purposes, and the building gets remodeled in a way. And so when they want to renovate it back to be a museum, they have to do some reconstruction. And so when you go down to the basement, you can see what were holding cells and torture cells, but all of those are reconstruction. So it's kind of interesting if you contrast that with or the sites we looked at earlier was the building used in Prague for Gestapo interrogations. And so this one, as you might recall, is entirely original. There are no reconstructions. That is the original floor. So there's and it also isn't open for tourism in the same way. We had this special tour that allowed us to go in. And so I think it's interesting in a way to see this space in Prague retain a lot of authenticity, while the space in Budapest is not only a reconstruction, but I think for those of us who visited it, there was almost an emphasis on what happened in this space in the building. I would say bordered on just right, kind of. And in some ways that spoke to the tone of the museum as well. If you, in the gift shop, if you go on their online gift shop, the first two books that you can see for purchase is one, The Orban Rule, which is a very glowing account of Viktor Orban's life. Again, he's their leader, who is very right-wing and authoritarian. And then you can see the Orban versus Soros. And one of the things that Orban has done is traded on a lot of anti-Semitic stereotypes, and certainly played, as you probably know, if you hear the word George Soros, it's usually in connection with some sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And certainly Viktor Orban has been instrumental in spreading some of that. But these are two of the books that you could, like the first ones that you can buy in a space that you would think the books might be about, the history of like something of the period, rather than these contemporary books as well. Then we have probably the most famous memorial. When people think about the Holocaust memorials in Budapest, most people think about the shoes on the Danube. And what's interesting about this memorial is it commemorates those who were murdered by the Arrow Cross, which was Hungary's fascist party. So they were not murdered by the Nazis themselves, but by Hungarian Nazis. And so in the late days of the war, thousands of people were lined up on the edge of the river or near the river and shot. They were asked to remove their shoes because the shoes could be repurposed. And so this memorial symbolizes those individuals that were killed and then thrown into the river. Interestingly, relatively recently, within the last 10 years, again, doing some river construction projects, there was a portion of the river that the city of Budapest drained. They found some human remains, and they were able to do some research and some testing and conclude that these were some of the Jewish people who were shot during those actions. And since then, steps were taken to properly bury those remains. But you can see, again, the shoes, and then a group of individuals who were there. We also saw outside the synagogue, there were several mass graves of people who were killed, again, in these final days of the war. This is something that I often talk about when we talk about memorialization. And when we look at how, whether it be just the war or the Holocaust in particular, the memorialization process is very specific, East versus West. And certainly this have a very distinct style of memorialization. It will always glorify Soviet liberators. oftentimes the memorials that are constructed are made in such a way that they can function as a site of commemoration and celebration, which is all about rising up the Soviets and condemning fascism. Though always within this, the people who are that they recognize as being killed by the Nazis are always labeled as victims of fascism. There's not anything more specific. Certainly the Jewishness of those victims is gone. So in Budapest, there was this memorial in Liberty Square, which is commemorating the Soviet liberation of the city. Now, the Soviets did lose significant numbers taking the city, a lot of street by street fighting to capture the city. At the same time, they certainly perpetrated a lot of violence against the citizens, not just like, you know, the Arrow Cross, but there was a lot of citizen death and certainly sexual assault of the women. So when this in the post-war world, it was not necessarily popular. And there's been a lot of, and then of course, you know, the Soviets maintained control of Hungary for the duration of the Cold War. So this is something that today there is a lot of discussion about, should it be removed? Should it be moved to a different location? Outside the city, they have a collection of like former Soviet memorials, and they've kind of put them outside the city. So there's some discussion about what should be done with that. Lidice, this is just sort of thinking about Soviet memorialization in general. We looked at the village of Lidice a couple of weeks ago. We talked about the memorial to the children victims of war that was installed more recently. This is one of the original parts of the memorial that was installed in the 1950s. And you can see this kind of relief sculpture that, if you look in detail at it, shows the deportation of women from Lidice, their time in the camp, and then their eventual return to the village to build new Lidice, which is what you see in the second photo. And just some, again, characteristic things of Soviet memorialization. We always have kind of like these heroic, strong-looking liberators, and there's always some sort of like joyous end, often portrayed in these this Soviet style. They also would bring Soviet, like members of the like military and whatnot would come to this space for commemoration as well. And the original memorial did play some of the recordings, video footage that the Nazis took of their destruction of the territory. I showed a little bit of some of those in the time we looked at Lidice. Once, you know, post-Soviet era, the museum, when it underwent some renovations, that was changed, and it was thought that these videos were too graphic, particularly because they showed like the murder of pets, and so those were removed. So that brings us to Auschwitz. Again, we touched on this a little bit last week, but not really in terms of what the memorialization museum space looks like. So we'll see how the Soviet influence was here as well. Here we have the famous gate of Auschwitz I. And what we see from the beginning is there's a real divide, of course, in how Auschwitz I, the original camp that mainly had a non-Jewish prison population, how that was preserved and memorialized, versus Birkenau, which of course is the death camp and the Jewish portion of this site. So here we have the same view as this one. Notice the Arbeit macht frei sign is missing. That is something that was taken down by the Soviets, and apparently a Soviet soldier had taken it and was gonna take it as a souvenir, and they were, I think, at some point a survivor saw him with it, like a bit of time after the war, not immediately, right? And was able to trade some vodka for this sign, and it was put into what became the museum, but it was not reinstalled. I think what most people don't realize about the museum space of Auschwitz is that it opened almost immediately after the war. So the museum officially opens in 1947, although people begin visiting the site as early as 1946. So the war is barely over, and people are wanting to return to this place for memorialization purposes and remembrance purposes. So this is when it opened in 47, and you can see, so this is not the main, this is not the Arbeit-Marktfrei gate of Auschwitz I. This is over by the crematorium. So they kind of, they change the entrance for flow. And the sign says, "To the martyrdom of the Polish nation and other nations in Auschwitz." I think this is an interesting chart to show too. We like to think of, say, Holocaust tourism or visiting these sites as a recent phenomenon. And certainly when we look at Auschwitz, like, people are visiting it almost immediately. And so you can see these numbers are really quite high. Now, there's a big difference in terms of total number of visitors and foreign visitors. So given the location and the Cold War, the amount of foreign visitors is relatively low. But the amount of visitors, I think, is surprisingly high. And the photo here shows this is a group on a tour in 1955, and they're in Krema too. So this is what the grounds of Birkenau looked like. And there's a small memorial to Jewish victims that's put up in 1948, and another one in 1955. You can see it there. Both the 48 and 55 memorials are removed in the 60s when they put up the International Monument to the Victims of Fascism. So again, note that name, International Victims of Fascism. There's not a mention of the Jewishness in this. And they also establish like the borders for the memorial site, which will include almost 500 acres. And you can see some of the photos from that dedication. Originally, these dedication plaques, even before the one at Birkenau, will cite 4 million. The number of people killed in Auschwitz as being 4 million, which is too high. It was an incorrect number that was ascertained even before the war was over. There was basically incorrect calculations led to this, but that number wasn't officially corrected until 1990. When we think about what makes up this collection, you can see there's lots of buildings, ruins, and of course, all of these require very specific care, preservation, and whatnot, in addition to not the buildings themselves, the structure of the camp themselves, and then, of course, the items that were left upon when the Soviets liberated the camp, and they found, you know, the clothes, the glasses, suitcases, that sort of thing. All of those things then become part of the museum's collection. And so that's what we see here. And if we think about each of these individual items, they all require very specific different types of care. And recently, Auschwitz has opened an incredible preservation lab with state-of-the-art technology, because, you know, how you preserve leather is very how you're going to preserve metal. So they need experts in all of these different materials in order to do that. Now, it's interesting. So these are the modern photos, and what you'll notice is there's a good deal of the memorial museum space that looks very similar to the original. And what they wanted to show was a lot of the belongings that were left. The hair, these are Zyklon B canisters at the bottom. It's their idea to put the barbed wire in front of it. I should also mention that, you know, even though Birkenau is included in that memorial protected space, the museum itself is going to be housed in Auschwitz I, right? Because that tells the Polish story. The martyrdom of the Polish nation story is told in Auschwitz I because Polish prisoners were held in Auschwitz I. And so that's the portion that is made into this museum. It's the portion that gets the most protection initially. The grounds of Birkenau, there was a lot of debate about what to do about it. At one point, they wanted to make it a sort of a memorial garden. At another point, they wanted to put a school there with vocational training. Eventually, it was protected and folded into the the memorial grounds. But as we'll see here in a second, the almost all the barracks were dismantled. Locals would take the wood, the bricks, because there were, after the war, there's a shortage of materials. These places weren't meant to be long-standing. And so they are torn down and repurposed. So there isn't, that doesn't maintain its wartime form like Auschwitz I does. And again, here you can see some of these early tours that are going through there. In 1950, it undergoes a kind of redesign because this one is very specific about selling communism, about highlighting the evils of the West, not just Nazis. So there's some anti-American exhibits that go up as well. In 1955, after Stalin's death, there's another redesign which gets rid of some of that, but not entirely. It will present in this 55 design, there is a presentation of the murder of the Jews, but it doesn't emphasize it as being like the primary victims of Birkenau. And again, they're still using that 4 million number. They'll begin the archive in the late 50s as well. And there's some early preservation efforts. Even in the 60s, you can see the roof of, this is the sauna, so the place where people would have been processed with their having their hair shaved and their tattoo given to them. That's the portion of Birkenau where that would have happened, and you can see the roof was missing, and then they have reconstructed that now. In the 60s they did. Here it is today. You can see there's the ruins of Krema 2, and then some of the buildings in Birkenau. All of these need to be like stabilized in some manner. The problem, you might think like, well, what preservation do you need to do on a pile of bricks, right? But it actually takes a good deal of effort and engineering to maintain these ruins in this arrested state of decay. The groundwater, the water table is particularly high here, and so kind of mitigating that is a huge focus of these preservation efforts, especially on the crematorium ruins. Auschwitz I did have a gas chamber. It was very limitedly in operation, and then so it's briefly in operation, and then once the big ones are opened in Birkenau, they close this one down and they make it into an air raid shelter. However, once the museum opens, they remodel it to its original gas chamber look, because they wanted to tell the entire story of Auschwitz in one location, and it was still standing. So this is also like a favorite point of deniers to say that the gas chamber in Auschwitz I was not a gas chamber, it was an air raid shelter. Twist is it's both. It was absolutely a gas chamber, limitedly used, and then it became an air raid shelter, and then it was transformed back into that for museum purposes. There have been some responsive changes in the museum. The hair is one. So if you had visited Auschwitz 20 years ago, you could take pictures of the hair. They really discourage that now. They have signs that say like you can take photographs of almost everything on the grounds. But because these are human remains, they now are prohibiting people from taking those photos, and they've also made the decision to let this hair naturally decay. Since the end of the war, it has been chemically treated to prevent that, and there was a big debate about what to do with this hair. Should it be buried? Should it be continue to be preserved? And there are people who objected to it being buried because this is not just the hair of people who were murdered, but people who potentially could have survived. And so a compromise was made, and that was to let it just naturally decay. They have put special glass in front of it to kind of slow that with light damage. But at some point, this really will, disintegrate into dust. Another change that's been made, you can see the blurred photo. This used to be there in Auschwitz I, and it was massive photos of people who had been subjected to Nazi medical experiments. So their bodies would have been operated on, sometimes having, pretty severe disfigurement. And the Soviets took pictures of these people to document the crime. However, these people did not consent to the experiments, and they didn't consent, nor did they consent to having those photos enlarged and put on display, because often in these pictures, they're naked. So not only are they showing wounds and whatnot, but they're usually naked. And so after some feedback, the museum made the decision to no longer display these in that way. There's other memorials within Auschwitz I. So this is the basement of Block 11, where it was the punishment block, also where the first gassing experiments took prisoners. There's standing cells down here, places where people were starved to death. One of the more famous people to be held here was Maximilian Kolbe, who was a Polish priest who took the place of a man who was supposed to be executed in Auschwitz, and he volunteered to die in his place and was later canonized by the Catholic Church. And so there's a memorial within that space to him. The bottom photo you can see that's a reconstruction of the execution wall, and people leave sort of, flowers and candles there as well. Within Auschwitz I, you can also see more of a museumification. You can also see the conditions for these Polish prisoners were significantly better than those of the Jewish ones at Birkenau, but you can see there are sinks and toilets and some of the bunks that are here, but there is much of this is like the bunks are reconstructions. Also with that, in Auschwitz I, there is some buildings that contain these national memorials, and that was part of the original design, but they didn't start opening until the 60s. Czechoslovakia in 1960, other countries follow suit. Over time, these have been updated and replaced. The most recent one to be updated is Austria, and so it also very openly deals with the fact that there were Austrian Nazis and Austrian perpetrators as well. So in addition to commemorating Austrian victims in Auschwitz, it is addressing perpetration as well. And the Russian exhibit, which I believe is currently closed, it's called Tragedy, Valor, and Liberation. So again, even though this was put up in 2013, it still maintains a lot of that Soviet flavor as well. The Yad Vashem memorial in this national memorial space. One of the features of it is this giant book of names that featured the names of Jewish people impacted in the Holocaust. And so you can see how large, how many pages this is. It's 2 sides, and you can also, if you look at that, how well worn it is, right? People look for their families' names here. And certainly there were, people who traveled with us who did just that. There's been a discussion about, should they replace these pages as they get dirty, or should they leave it because that itself becomes a part of the memorial? And it is really interesting because you can see by that human touch, you get a sense of how many people have looked at it and touched it and been there and remembered. Similarly, I put a picture of the stairs here in one of the buildings in Auschwitz I, because you can see how the stone itself is worn away because there's been so many millions of visitors that have come here in the post-war period. Less positive leaving their mark. There's 2 examples. One is a guest book from the early days of Auschwitz, so people who are writing thoughtful inscriptions. The other one are essentially what amounts to graffiti in the women's barracks in Birkenau. And so people would write their name and somebody else's name, all kinds of sort of like etchings in the brick. And again, as part of their preservation efforts, Auschwitz now is going back and trying to, remove those that sort of graffiti and defacement. This does bring us to then the question of Holocaust tourism, right? So this is kind of something we've talked a little bit about in other sessions, but what is the difference between what we're doing and a tourist? And I think, obviously the intent matters hugely. Being well informed before you go, being cognizant of how you act in these spaces is really important. But the other thing to keep in mind, and while we use the word tourism, it has such I think the immediate reaction is to kind of step back from it because it always has such a negative connotation. And in fact, if you know, there's truth to this. You know, you can see the photos I have here. These were fridge magnets for sale in the gift shop outside of Birkenau. So you could have a fridge magnet of the gates of Auschwitz, or here we have, you know, in Krakow advertising like free pub crawl, and then underneath it is see Auschwitz, see the salt mine, right? So it's just thrown in there with these other sites when in fact going to these places is very different. And I think the important thing to always keep in mind is we do want people to go to these places, because if no one did, that would be upsetting too, right? Because the fact that people are going there, it is an act of memory, it is remembrance. But it's really important to make sure that you're doing so in a respectful manner, and being aware that even though maybe your day before you got to Auschwitz, maybe your day was a tour of the salt mine or a pub crawl later that night. But when you're in that moment, what you're doing is something very different. It's very different memory work. At the same time, we have to be aware that these are spaces that have real logistical concerns, right? You do need parking lots, you need bathrooms, you need food for people because they're going to be there for a while. So the picture on the end is a cafe that exists in outside of Dachau. So rather than like, it's not on grounds of the camp, but it's just outside. Like I said, you're going to need bathrooms in a place like this. However, this is also Dachau. Maybe a poor choice to put a toilet directly under, you know, right, that is the chimney of the crematorium there in Dachau. So perhaps not the most respectful choice to put a bathroom there. This, you know, thinking about how to be cognizant of accommodating visitors while remaining respectful. So when we think about this active tourism and how some of these large sites can, I guess people can almost have like an expected feeling when they go there. And people the site themselves are expecting large volumes of tourists, right? If you look at this photo, you need a huge parking lot to accommodate the tour buses that are going to be stopping in these places. So you need a parking lot, you need the bathrooms, you need all those things. One of the, I think, most interesting and impactful places that we visited on our trip was a little town of Zvolen, Slovakia. There's about 40,000 people, so it's a relatively, you know, it's a small city. The Jewish community there dates to the late 19th century. In the whole country of Slovakia, prior to the Holocaust, there was about 90,000 Jewish people living. There were 70,000 killed in the Holocaust. The Jewish community of Sloven was relatively small. But of that population, you know, it's about 600,000, or not 600,000, 632. Almost all of those people will be deported or murdered there. And there's a picture of the synagogue as it was before the war. And here's a picture of the synagogue as it is now. It is a gym and a Chinese restaurant. There's a plaque on the wall that notes it. And there are less than 10 Jewish people who live in Zvolen today. And there's less than 3,000 that live in the entire country of Slovakia. Slovakia was another country who, you know, was an ally of Germany during the war. So it has a little bit of a different history. But Zvolen itself is interesting because you see there was both deportations, people who were deported for slave labor in the early 40s, people who were then later deported to Auschwitz in the later portion of the war. And here at the side of the Jewish cemetery, there were people who were in 44 as well. So you have that kind of like combination of experiences. Today, the Jewish cemetery has been restored, and outside of it, this is the Park of Generous Souls. This is the Obelisk of Hope. It's hundreds of layers of glass glued together. The list on the wall is a list of Slovakian people who helped their Jewish neighbors. They're listed as rescuers there. This is what the cemetery looks like. Again, there's been some restoration. Here's the mass grave of people who were shot during the the war there, and the cemetery then was vandalized and destroyed. And in 1999, it was restored. That was, and then in addition to the obelisk of hope, we have the threshold of life, which kind of represents like a grave and rebirth. You can actually walk down into it. And these are the top. You can see that the stones that represent prayers and souls and prayers for those souls. Here we have our group. We were met there in Zvolen. It was a rainy day, and we really weren't expecting to have the rich experience in this town that we were, and we were met there by a local guide who then contacted the head of the sort of local Jewish community there, and he's the man in the tan coat, and he's responsible for this rehabilitation of the cemetery and organizing these monuments that were put up both inside and outside the cemetery. And he spoke to us about this project, about being his parents. He's Jewish. His parents came back to the town after the war. And so again, if you how few people there were left for them to decide to continue to make their home there in this town is a really powerful thing. And then the second picture, you see members of the second generation who traveled with us. We have this man who was a 2G with the members of our trip who were a second and third generation as well. And the last memorial in this small town is one of the memorial to the unforgotten neighbors and the crying fountain. And this particular memorial is more in the center of town, and it speaks to those who were specifically deported. So you have the memorials in the cemetery to those who were murdered there, and then you have this memorial in town to the deportations. And I think what's really striking when you look at how many memorials are in this tiny town of 40,000, they weren't like, they didn't put this up for people to come to. This is a project that specifically, this man and others wanted to do for that specific space. And I think that this stop in Zvolen was a great reminder that so often when we think about how the Holocaust was perpetrated in Europe, we think about Auschwitz, we think about the big death camps, these sites that have become famous. But when we go to a town like Zvolen, we're reminded that it happened not just in 6 death camps in the East, not just in 44,000 camps across occupied Europe, but in thousands and thousands of towns. Every community in Europe practically has a story like this. And so Zvolen was a great reminder of that, the widespreadness, and also what can happen when a particular place decides to memorialize for itself. When we were in the town, lots of the townspeople kind of, they weren't used to seeing a group of tourists traipsing through their space. It was kind of an oddity, which again makes you, and the man we met with, he asked, how did you know to stop here? Because this was something that was quite unusual to get people from the outside. And so their memorialization was very much internally motivated. All right. And with that, I will invite Jerry and Joyce on to say a bit about their reflections of our time there. Jerry, why don't we start with you? If you'd like to share the most impactful part of being in the Auschwitz I memorial space.
It had to be visiting the basement of block 1 and the cell where Maximilian Kolbe ultimately died. As you mentioned, Shelley, he had chosen to take the place of another prisoner who pleaded for his life because he was a husband, a father, and so forth. And so Colby, along with a dozen or so others, were imprisoned for a couple of weeks with no food. And when he when the Nazis found that he was still alive, they proceeded to murder him by a phenol injection, which is something they had done to other unfortunate prisoners. Um, I have a fairly long history of studying Colby. The icon that you showed during the course of your presentation was one I'm familiar with from many years ago because it was in the lobby of a Catholic high school where my niece and nephew attended. So, fast forwarding to a couple of years ago or a year ago at Auschwitz, I was quite literally brought to tears when I knelt and prayed at his cell. Um, I'll just add a couple of facts of interest. He was canonized for his act of charity and giving up his life for the Polish army sergeant that you mentioned, canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1982. And a couple of interesting bits of trivia about that. John Paul himself was born less than 20 miles from Auschwitz in 1920, and the man who Maximilian saved, Francis Gajovnicek, actually long survived the war, and he was actually present at the ceremony in the Vatican in 1982, 41 years after the fact. So, pretty touching, remarkable story that was.
Yeah, thank you. Joyce, could you tell us about your experience at Auschwitz One, particularly about your experience with the Book of Names?
So there was a picture that was in the presentation of my daughter Alex, also went on the trip with me. And the two of us found the names of my mother and a number of members of my mother's family. We found the name of my grandmother, and it shows that she was from Vilna, Poland. At the time, it was Poland. Now it's Lithuania. And that she was murdered in Stutthof. That's what the records indicate. And then we find the name of my mother on the list, and it shows her name and where she's from. And I got a picture of it that I pulled up today from our trip. It says Borovic, Sonia, Vilna, Poland, place of death unknown. That's because it was Kansas City, because she survived and moved to Kansas City and passed in 2007. But it was really something to see her name, having known her, whereas there's a whole bunch of Borovics that were from Vilna, Poland, that were on this list of names that I had no idea about. And that my mother really never spoke about specific names of relatives and whether Borovic was a common name, because there's a whole bunch of Borovics throughout Poland, I guess, because there was a number of those names. So that was really touching to see names of people that could have been part of my family that I just didn't know about. And then the other thing that was interesting was to spend time when we were in Slovakia, to spend time with the 2G guide that came to see us, who's responsible for that memorial, to just, when you meet somebody that is a child of a survivor, you kind of have a connection that is kind of unspoken. And to meet somebody on the other side of the world that is a child of a survivor also still gives you that type of connection that you really don't have with anybody else. And I was just thrilled and honored to be on this trip. I'm taking the next one too, because the next trip is going to Vilnius, Lithuania, which is where my mom was from. And so I'll be finding her place in her home and taking it. And that trip I'm going to be taking with my brother and his family. So it was one of the most memorable experiences of my life.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I thought it interesting as well that, you speak of that connection you had with the other 2G. And I think it's worth noting to people, he didn't speak English, right? So we were doing all of this through a translator, and even through that translation, this experience was still, so powerful and palpable. Jessica, do you have anything to add about your thoughts on either of these locations?
I'm just gonna put my hat in with Zvolen. If you read our newsletter, you know I was completely taken with it for all of the reasons that they just described. But I think it's remarkable. In a lot of ways, it makes complete sense what Joyce just said about this kind of automatic connection that members of survivor families have with each other. As somebody who is not a member of a survivor family, it was a really magical thing to witness. It was a moment that nobody planned. We were in this small place that nobody had anticipated having the impact that it would. And I would go out on a limb and say that for the vast majority of our group, that moment is a standout moment that nobody could have created. It just happened and was a really beautiful way to engage with memory in this topic.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I would definitely agree with Jessica. It was so unexpected, and it made it all the more powerful for that sort of surprise. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd also like to remind you we have our annual Kristallnacht commemoration tonight at 6:30 at the White Theater at the Jewish Community Center. It's called Beyond Broken Glass, and it is a dance performance that honors the experience of those in Kristallnacht, and particularly highlighting families from our local Kansas City community who were involved in that. So again, 6:30 tonight. Hope to see some of you there. Otherwise, have a good rest of your day.